The Vietnam War was a conflict defined by the violent intersection of high-technology aviation and primitive jungle survival. Above the dense emerald canopy of Phuoc Toi Province, the air was often filled with the roar of American General Dynamics F-111s or Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters. However, the sky was a treacherous domain. North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong forces had mastered the art of anti-aircraft warfare, turning the beautiful horizon into a lethal grid of flak and surface-to-air missiles. The story begins on a humid afternoon when a routine mission suddenly turns into a nightmare. A U.S. strike aircraft, crippled by a well-placed burst of 37mm anti-aircraft fire, erupts in a ball of flame and orange smoke. As the pilot ejects, the roar of the engines is replaced by an eerie, whistling silence. Below him lies a vast, impenetrable sea of green, a territory controlled entirely by an enemy that treats the jungle as their own backyard. The pilot drifts down, his parachute a white beacon that attracts every enemy eye for miles. The moment his boots hit the muddy floor of the jungle, a desperate race begins. He is alone, potentially injured, and equipped only with a survival radio and a sidearm. His mayday call cuts through the static of the command centers, triggering an immediate and frantic search and rescue SAR operation. While the U.S. Air Force and Navy scramble their assets, the environment on the ground is suffocating. The jungle is a labyrinth of razor-sharp vines, swarming insects, and the constant rhythmic sound of rain. For the downed pilot, every snap of a twig sounds like a gunshot. He knows that within minutes, enemy tracking teams will be closing in, following the smoke of the crash and the trail of his parachute. But as the enemy closes the net, something else is moving through the undergrowth, something that makes no sound at all. Operating in the same sector is a small six-man patrol from the Australian SAS. While the American SAR teams prepare for a massive, noisy aerial extraction, the Aussie troopers have already melted into the shadows. They do not run toward the smoke. They move with a glacial, calculated silence that defies the natural chaos of the forest. The pilot's survival now rests on a razor's edge. He is caught between a fast-approaching enemy, seeking a prize for propaganda, and a group of elite phantoms who are the only ones capable of reaching him before the trap snaps shut. The roar of the jet may have signaled the start of the disaster, but it is the absolute silence of the SAS that will determine if he ever sees the sky again. As the downed pilot's emergency beacon continued to pulse, the American military machine responded with its trademark characteristic, overwhelming force. High above the crash site, the Jolly Green Giant rescue helicopters began their approach, flanked by a swarm of A-1 Sky Raiders. The plan was a textbook combat search and rescue (CSR) operation. Suppress the area with a curtain of fire, hover over the survivor, and hoist him to safety. However, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was well prepared for this predictable display of aerial dominance. They knew that a downed pilot was the ultimate bait. Hidden beneath the triple canopy jungle, they had moved heavy machine guns and anti-aircraft batteries into position, creating a lethal, killing box around the pilot's suspected location. As the lead rescue helicopters descended, they were met with a wall of lead. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the sky, and the thunder of 37mm flak shook the air. Despite repeated attempts, the American rescue fleet was repeatedly repelled. The pilots of the Sky Raiders dove low, unleashing napalm and 20mm cannons to scour the hillsides, but the enemy was too well entrenched. Every time a helicopter hovered, it became a sitting duck. The heavy firepower that had won battles in open fields was failing here, trapped by the verticality and density of the Vietnamese terrain. The more noise the rescue mission made, the more it alerted every enemy squad within 10 miles to the exact prize they were hunting. Inside the command center, the mood turned grim. The golden hour, the window of time where a pilot has the best chance of rescue before being captured, was rapidly closing. The massive aerial armada was a hammer trying to hit a needle in a haystack, and the needle was surrounded by hornets. The American commanders realized with a sinking heart that their standard doctrine was insufficient. They could not blast the pilot out of the jungle without risking the lives of dozens more airmen. It was in this moment of tactical stalemate that a quiet, alternative proposal reached the radio operators. While the sky was a chaotic inferno of jet engines and explosions, A six-man patrol from the Australian SAS was already on the ground, mere kilometers away. They didn't ask for air cover, and they didn't need a heavy escort. They operated on a different frequency and a different philosophy. To the American command, the area was a no-go zone, filled with certain death. To the Aussies, it was just another day in the office. They understood that where the hammer failed, the scalpel might succeed. The decision was made to halt the noisy aerial incursions and give the Phantoms a chance to do what they did best: work in the shadows where Hulk, firepower, could not reach. The heavy engines of the American fleet turned back, leaving the jungle to a sudden, heavy silence. A silence that the SAS was about to weaponize. While the sky above Phuoc Tui was still scarred by the smoke of retreating American jets, the six-man Australian SAS patrol had already transitioned into a state of total tactical immersion. For these troopers, the failure of the aerial rescue was not a deterrent. It was the signal that the soft approach was now the only path to success. They did not sprint toward the crash site. Instead, they dissolved into the vegetation, moving with a glacial, rhythmic deliberation that made them virtually invisible to anything but the most seasoned eye. The Australian patrol leader, a veteran of Malaya and Borneo, understood that the enemy would be rushing to the parachute's location like a shark to blood. To survive, the SAS had to outthink and outpace the NVA trackers without ever being seen. Their Tham Nap, Infiltration, was a masterpiece of jungle stealth. They moved in a staggered file, each man stepping precisely where the man in front had stepped to minimize the disturbance of the forest floor. They didn't push through vines, they slid around them. They didn't step on dry leaves, they felt the ground with their boots before committing their weight. The silence of an Australian SAS patrol was not merely the absence of speech, it was a disciplined suppression of every mechanical and biological sound. Their equipment was taped down to prevent the metallic clink of gear. Their breathing was shallow and controlled. They communicated through a sophisticated language of hand signals, avoiding even the faintest whisper that could carry through the humid air. As they moved deeper into the enemy-held zone, the SAS began to encounter the tripwires of the jungle. They found fresh footprints, NVA search parties moving parallel to them, less than 50 meters away. Most soldiers would have felt the urge to open fire, but the Aussies remained motionless, melting into the shadows and letting the enemy pass. They were not there to fight a war, they were there to steal a man back from the jaws of the tiger. Their progress was a lesson in jungle warfare. They navigated not by GPS or heavy maps, but by an intuitive understanding of the terrain's flow. They used the sounds of the jungle, the sudden silence of birds or the scurry of small animals, to map out the enemy's positions. While the American forces often viewed the jungle as a hostile wall, the SAS viewed it as a protective cloak. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the SAS patrol had successfully bypassed 3 enemy cordons. They were now within the red zone, the immediate vicinity of the downed pilot. The air here was heavy with the smell of scorched earth and jet fuel, but it was also crawling with enemy search teams. The SAS was no longer just patrolling, they were hunting. They were looking for the minute signs of a frightened man, a torn piece of flight suit, a snapped branch, or the faint metallic scent of a survival radio. The Phantoms had arrived, and though the enemy was everywhere, they had no idea they were being watched by the deadliest hunters in the Vietnam War. The SAS patrol had now entered the most treacherous phase of the mission, the immediate search area where the downed pilot was likely hiding. The density of North Vietnamese Army NVA troops had increased significantly. The enemy was no longer just patrolling, but actively combing the brush, their voices and the clatter of their equipment drifting through the humid air. In this environment, any mistake meant certain death. Yet the Australian SAS maintained their composure, utilizing their mastery of jungle warfare to navigate the tightening net. The patrol leader signaled for a halt and listen every few meters. This was the legendary Australian jungle stealth in action. They weren't just looking for the pilot, they were looking for the disturbances he had left behind. An untrained survivor often leaves a trail of accidental clues: a heel print in the soft mud, a bruised leaf, or a scrap of survival rations. The SAS troopers, trained as snake eaters, with a primal understanding of the forest, could distinguish between the natural decay of the jungle and the frantic movements of a man in flight. As they crept closer to the crash site, the smell of burnt JP-4 fuel became overpowering. They discovered the pilot's discarded parachute, partially stuffed into a hollow log, a desperate but amateur attempt at concealment. To the NVA, this was a clear signpost. To the SAS, it was a data point to calculate the pilot's probable heading. They knew a downed aviator's instinct would be to find high ground or a thick thicket to hide in while waiting for the roar of a rescue helicopter. However, the SAS also knew the NVA was using a beat system, moving in lines to flush the pilot out like prey. The Australians had to cross these lines. They did so by timing their movements to the natural rhythms of the jungle and the noisy progress of the enemy. While the NVA soldiers were focused on looking for a man in a flight suit, they completely missed the 6 phantoms who had Boyson Nguai Trang applied camouflage paint so effectively that they appeared as mere shadows shifting between the teak trees. The tension reached a breaking point when the patrol encountered a fresh NVA resting area. The enemy had stopped for water and a smoke, barely 20 meters from the Australians' path. The SAS troopers froze. For 10 agonizing minutes, they remained as still as statues, their camouflage blending perfectly with the moss and ferns. They didn't even swat away the mosquitoes drawing blood from their faces. This was the psychological resilience that separated them from regular recruits. They possessed the cold blood required to wait out the enemy in their own backyard. Once the enemy moved on, the SAS continued their meticulous search. They were now in the kill zone, the final few hundred meters. The patrol leader spotted it first, a faint metallic glint beneath a pile of palm fronds. It wasn't an enemy trap. It was the antenna of a PRC-90 survival radio. The pilot was close, but he was terrified, likely hearing the NVA searchers and ready to bolt or fire his weapon at anything that moved. The SAS had to reach him before his fear gave his position away to the hundreds of enemy soldiers closing in from all sides. The downed American pilot, Lieutenant Miller, lay pressed into the damp earth, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every rustle of a leaf or snap of a distant twig felt like a death sentence. To his left, he could hear the rhythmic clatter of NVA equipment and the low murmur of voices. They were no more than 30 yards away, systematically probing the thicket where he lay. Miller clutched his Smith & Wesson .38 revolver, his knuckles white, prepared to fire his last few rounds before the inevitable. He was a man lost in a green hell, waiting for a miracle that the heavy American helicopters had already failed to provide. Then, the impossible happened. Without a single sound, no crack of a branch, no rustle of fabric, a shadow seemed to detach itself from the very tree trunk Miller was leaning against. Before he could cry out or raise his weapon, a gloved hand, caked in dark mud and forest green paint, clamped firmly but calmly over his mouth. A face appeared inches from his own, not the face of a captor, but a face camouflaged in a disruptive pattern of black and olive drab, with eyes that were terrifyingly calm. "Easy, mate," a voice whispered in a thick, calm Australian accent, so low it was almost felt rather than heard. "We're the SAS. You're coming home." Miller froze, his brain struggling to process the transition from certain death to this sudden, ghostly presence. He hadn't heard them approach. He hadn't seen them move. To the American pilot, it felt as though these men had simply materialized out of the humid air, the saviors from nowhere. The SAS patrol leader signaled his men. Instantly, 2 other troopers appeared from the undergrowth, their XM-177 carbines leveled at the perimeter with lethal intent. They didn't speak. They moved with a synchronized fluidity that spoke of thousands of hours of training. One trooper handed Miller a sip of water and a piece of glucose, his eyes never leaving the tree line where the NVA search party was still audible. The contrast was staggering. Miller had expected a roaring rescue, a storm of lead, and the thundering blades of a Huey. Instead, he had been found by 6 shadows who treated the enemy's proximity with a cold, professional indifference. The SAS didn't look like the soldiers Miller was used to. They wore no heavy helmets, no bulky flak jackets. They were lean, stripped-down hunters who moved with the grace of predators. "Can you walk?" The patrol leader signaled through a hand gesture. Miller nodded, still in shock. The leader gave a sharp, silent signal, and the patrol began to shift. The extraction had begun, But it wouldn't be a dash for safety. It would be a slow, agonizing crawl through the heart of the enemy's search zone, led by the phantoms who had just plucked him from the edge of the abyss. For the first time since his plane went down, Miller felt a flicker of hope, not because of Hoaluk, firepower, but because of the terrifyingly quiet men who now surrounded him. The mission had now reached its most perilous stage, the extraction. Finding Lieutenant Miller was a feat of tracking, but moving a shell-shocked pilot, whose every step felt like a drumbeat in the stillness, through a tightening enemy perimeter, was a logistical nightmare. The Australian SAS knew that the NVA search parties, frustrated by their failure to find the prize, would be increasing their aggression. The Phantoms had to lead Miller through a gauntlet where the enemy was often less than 20 meters away. The patrol leader implemented a leapfrog movement. 2 troopers moved forward to scout the path, their eyes scanning for tripwires or glints of sunlight on metal, while 2 others stayed with Miller, literally guiding his feet to avoid dry branches or noisy foliage. The final 2 troopers formed the rear guard, walking backward for long stretches to monitor their own trail. They were moving against the flow of the enemy's search, utilizing a tactic of calculated caution. As they crossed a shallow creek, the heart-stopping moment arrived. A North Vietnamese patrol, nearly a platoon in strength, appeared on the opposite bank. The SAS leader gave the silent signal to freeze. Miller, trembling with adrenaline, felt a hand press firmly on his shoulder, forcing him down into the waist-deep mud and rotting leaves. For 5 agonizing minutes, they remained submerged and motionless. The NVA soldiers were so close that the SAS could hear the clink of their canteens and the smell of their tobacco. This was the ultimate test of psychological resilience. While Miller's instinct was to bolt, the SAS troopers remained as still as the trees around them. Their camouflage, darkened by the creek water and mud, rendered them invisible. The enemy passed by, oblivious to the fact that their target and his rescuers were mere feet away. This was the difference between life and death in the Vietnam War, the ability to master one's own fear and become a part of the landscape. To further ensure their escape, the rearguard began planting distractions. They utilized small, delayed-action explosives and jumping jack mines placed far from their actual path. When these detonated minutes later, the NVA commanders would naturally divert their search teams toward the noise, thinking they had finally cornered the Americans. This use of stealth and deception allowed the small Australian team to slip through the gaps in the enemy's formation. The escape was a grueling marathon of silence. Every muscle in Miller's body ached from the unnatural, slow-motion movement, but he was revitalized by the sheer professionalism of his rescuers. They didn't speak a word for hours. The only communication was the occasional light squeeze on the arm or a subtle hand gesture. By the time they reached the green zone, a pre-designated area far enough from the crash site to allow for a safe aerial pickup, the sun had nearly set. The SAS had successfully navigated the heart of the tiger's den, proving that, in the jungle, the most powerful weapon wasn't a bomb, but a shadow that knew how to move. As the SA patrol reached the edge of the designated green zone, the deceptive calm of the jungle was shattered. The NVA had finally realized they were being toyed with. The distractions planted by the rearguard had bought precious time, but the enemy was now closing in from 3 sides, fueled by the realization that their prize was slipping away. The silence that had protected the Australians for hours was no longer an option. It was time for a hot extract. The patrol leader signaled for Miller to stay low between 2 troopers as they broke into a clearing, a small, natural opening in the canopy, just wide enough for a rescue hoist. The distant thump-thump of a U.S. Huey helicopter began to reverberate through the air. This was the most vulnerable moment, the transition from the invisible phantom state to a fixed, loud, and stationary target. "Pop smoke!" the leader barked, the first time Miller had heard him raise his voice. A canister of thick, purple smoke billowed into the air, signaling their exact position to the approaching pilot. Almost instantly, the tree line erupted in muzzle flashes. The NVA had reached the perimeter of the clearing. What followed was a masterclass in small unit fire discipline. The Australian SAS didn't just spray bullets, they fired in controlled, lethal bursts from their XM177s, suppressing the enemy's advance while maintaining their formation around the pilot. They were using the wall of lead only as a temporary shield to buy seconds. The Huey roared overhead, its door gunners unleashing a devastating stream of fire from their M60s into the foliage to keep the NVA at bay. Because the clearing was too small for a landing, the long-line extraction was the only choice. A high-tensile steel cable with a stabo rig descended from the belly of the vibrating machine. Go, go, go! The SAS troopers moved with mechanical efficiency. They didn't just shove Miller toward the rope. They secured him into the harness with practiced hands, ensuring the terrified pilot was locked in before the helicopter began its vertical surge. Two troopers hooked themselves to the secondary lines, flanking Miller to provide a human shield and suppressive fire even as they left the ground. As the cable pulled taut, Miller felt himself being yanked upward, away from the mud and the blood. Looking down, he saw the remaining SAS troopers on the ground, still calm, still firing with surgical precision as they waited for the second lift. They were silhouettes against the purple smoke and the muzzle flashes. Warriors who had entered the hell of the jungle as shadows and were now leaving it as legends. The Huey banked hard, pulling the men up through the canopy. The last thing Miller saw before the green leaves swallowed the clearing was the patrol leader, standing his ground until the very last second, a Vikutintuhuvo, who had stared death in the face and didn't blink. The pilot was safe, but the men who saved him were already preparing for the next shadow they would have to inhabit. The successful rescue of Lieutenant Miller was more than just a daring tactical feat. It served as a definitive case study in the effectiveness of the Australian SAS philosophy during the Vietnam War. While the massive search and rescue armadas of the United States relied on overwhelming HA-Luke, firepower, and technological dominance, the SAS proved that in the dense, asymmetric environment of the jungle, the most potent weapon is the highly trained, psychologically resilient individual. The rescue highlighted a fundamental strategic lesson. Quality, when honed to an elite level, can achieve what mass quantity cannot. The U.S. military machine, built for large-scale industrial warfare, often struggled when its logistical and aerial superiority was neutralized by terrain or anti-aircraft tactics. In contrast, the Australian Phantom approach, rooted in jungle stealth, patience, and survival, turned the environment from an enemy into an ally. The SAS didn't try to overpower the jungle. They became a part of it. This mission underscored the importance of selective recruitment and specialized training. The Australian system didn't just produce soldiers, it produced snake eaters who could operate with total autonomy deep within enemy territory. For the American pilot, the SAS were Vikutintuhuvo, saviors from nowhere. But for the Australian command, they were the logical result of a doctrine that prioritized fieldcraft over firepower. The ability of 6 men to bypass entire NBA companies to retrieve a high-value asset demonstrated that a small, elite unit with the right mindset could exert a strategic influence far beyond its size. Furthermore, the rescue illustrated the power of psychological resilience. The discipline required to lie motionless while an enemy patrol passes mere feet away, as seen in the naked patrols and various snatch missions, is a level of mental fortitude that cannot be mass-produced. It requires a military culture that values the quiet professional over the aggressive hunter. In the decades following the Vietnam War, the tactics perfected by the SASR in Phuoc Tuy became foundational for modern special operations globally. The U.S. military itself, recognizing the limitations of raw power in irregular warfare, began to integrate Australian-style tracking, acoustic discipline, and low-signature patrolling into its elite training programs, such as for the Navy SEALs and Delta Force. Ultimately, the story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam is a testament to the enduring truth of warfare. Technology and numbers are formidable, but they are often secondary to the skill, stealth, and spirit of the individual soldier. The Phantoms of the Jungle prove that silence is not just a tactical choice, it is a strategic advantage that can pluck victory from the heart of a green hell.